As usual, thanking God again. Let's pick up on a theme that we saw back in Psalms roughly 92 through 98, and again in Ecclesiastes 12, and that being seasons, understanding that life brings us individually into seasons. The end of the book of Jeremiah seems to describe the way that God is bringing nations into seasons. Generally, seasons of accountability, a concept we saw all the way back in the book of Isaiah, as much of it split God's attention between his judgment or seasons of accountability on his people, Israel, and the surrounding nations. Now, as we said, Jeremiah is talking about that judgment on the surrounding nations. This season, as its attention or God's attention turns to Moab, seems to describe their season of accountability as a season of shame. So let's use that as a title in this chapter, chapter 48. It starts out in verses 1 through 9, as we said, focusing God's attention on Moab, issuing a woe to Nebo and at least one of its other cities, describing the way that they are laid waste and broken in shame. Silence describing what is going to come over at least some of the Moabites, understanding the desolation and destruction coming to them by way of sword, which will produce weeping in others, quite possibly. Some called to flee. Why? Because they trusted in their works, in their treasures, and like the Israelites and other nations, that God is judging their idols, as God is going to call out one of their apparent idols, Chemosh, by name, saying in verse 10, "Cursed is the one who does the work of God with slackness, who restrains his sword." Talking about the way that we have seen the Babylonians described as merciless. This is saying that it seems God is calling on a curse, or calling a curse on those who show mercy or are slack in executing judgment against Moab. Once again, going on in verses 11 through 13, saying that at least part of this has come to Moab, a nation we haven't heard talked about a lot, even though I think Isaiah prophesied their downfall as well, but describing what caught my attention as potentially being unique about Moab's judgment, and that is the way that they were at ease from their youth, and therefore their confidence was inflated in the way that some of the other nations that might have seen hard times or harder times already might not have had. Therefore, God is talking about the way that their confidence in Chemosh, or their God, is going to erode, the way in which Judah's confidence in Bethel fled or eroded during the days of their judgment. Going on in verses 14 through 17, seeming to build on that concept of their idle or false confidence, saying, "How can you call yourselves heroes and mighty men, understanding the destruction, the calamity, and the affliction that are drawing near to you?" Taking almost a pause, seemingly to say how the mighty scepter of Moab is broken in verses 18 through 20, going on to describe the way that Moab's might has descended into shame. Verses 21 through 25, describing the way that judgment has come to its cities far and near. None shall escape. With verses 26 through 27, using a familiar metaphor with God's judgment, make them drunk because they magnified themselves, or Moab magnified himself against the Lord, having grown very proud. Verses 28 through 36 will describe the way that they were haughty, insolent, and false in their boasts and in their deeds. Nevertheless, it's going to describe the way that God mourns even in his judgment and days of accountability that he's bringing to Moab, characterized by the way he is going to stop the wine presses, representing the way that he is going to end the joy in Moab, describing even further the way that their riches have turned to ruin. Verses 37 through 44, describing them as a broken vessel that no one cares for, going on again to describe their descent into shame, describing their days of judgment in a way that reminded me of the way that I think the prophet Amos described God's judgment on Israel, saying that the one who escapes the terror on deck for Moab will find the pit, and the one who escapes the pit will find the snare, seeming to remind me of Psalm 73's description of the way that God brings the wicked into slippery places. Verses 45 through 46 of Jeremiah 48. However, going on to talk about the woe coming to them also in the form of captivity, as verse 47 will say, at least in a word of potential encouragement, even still, he will restore their fortunes. Concluding by saying, thus far is the judgment on Moab. As we said, potentially offering them at least a bit of a silver lining, understanding that the Moabites were descendants of God's mercy in some ways, his mercy on Lot. Even though they were born out of shame, he has brought them to a place of might. However, their might and their comfort seems to have bred a level of pride that God is now going to bring to an end by once again bringing them into a season of shame. Reminding me of what we saw in the last chapter of how impossible it can be to turn off the faucet on God's judgment once he's turned it on. Reminding me also why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, whether individually or nationally. May we all, people of every tribe, nation, and tongue, seek his help in genuinely guiding us back into places of righteousness and justice, and here, humility, so that we do not provoke him into turning on our seasons of shame.